welcome to That Was the Week That Was, week 21 of 2023, where Vince McLeod, author of Clown World Chronicles, explains the events of the past week in terms of the 6th position. Hey Vince, how you doing?
Hey Bob, I'm doing really well here in Nelson. It's still reasonably warm because it's so humid, but mostly I'm just glad not to have been nuked yet.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's jump straight into it. This week, Vince, there was talk of a far-right, neo-Nazi Russian volunteer corps fighting with Ukraine, making insurgencies into Russia. If this were not Clown World, I would think that these reports were satire. What's your take?
The problem is for most people that they don't realize the extent of the discontent among the Russian population with regards to this war. This was sold by Vladimir Putin when the war began as a special military operation that was going to take 3 days, and they were going to take over Kiev, and then Ukraine was going to surrender. Now they're on about day 430, and it shows no signs of a Russian victory anytime soon. So there are a large number of people in Russia who are very unhappy about what's going on. So there is potential for a civil war, some kind of attempt to overthrow Vladimir Putin, but I don't think necessarily that this is it. I think these units are probably Ukrainian, and they've gone in from the Ukrainian side, but still, it's there could be separatist movements coming online in coming months.
In 2020, you wrote in Clown World Chronicles that numerous people would support tyranny if they believed that that tyranny would deal to their enemies. Is Putin supported in Russia because he's perceived as dealing to the West?
In Russia, they certainly see the Western world as the opposition to a major extent. They consider themselves to be the spiritual descendants of the Soviet Union, and therefore to have inherited their Cold War against the Western world, in particular America. So I think that Putin does have a lot of support from these kind of sectors, and I think that they are fighting a very realistically, they're fighting at least another Cold War. This is another proxy war. This proxy war is much closer to a full scale hot war than we've ever been before. So I think these are very dangerous times.
Well, last week at the COVID summit in the European Union Parliament, Dr. David E. Martin stated that COVID-19 was an act of biological warfare perpetrated on the human race. Tyranny comes in many forms. Have we in fact witnessed medical tyranny? And if so, who exactly is the enemy?
It's not clear who was behind the creation of the COVID virus, assuming that it has been created in a lab, been released from a lab. It's not necessarily clear who this was. The trail seems to have pointed back to China, to Wuhan, but it seems also that that particular laboratory was collaborating with a lot of people on the American side, in particular in the Biden administration. So it's not, as of yet, known who the actual enemy is. But the response from the Western governments was certainly tyranny, in particular the mandates that were pushed on us, and all the people who lost their jobs, and many who lost the ability to socialize because of not being able to allowed to go to restaurants or pubs or other public places. So I think tyranny, the governments have really taken an opportunity to push tyranny on us rather than it having just come naturally.
Well, Martin also said that the pandemic was a financial heist and that nature and science were both hijacked. Trust really has been shattered. You have called before for a brotherhood of philosopher kings to stand up and provide leadership. What is the mark of a philosopher king in 2023, Vince?
Really, it's the same as what it was back when Plato was writing, which is that a person can see the world of forms. The most important thing is that a person can see the world of forms, can see the ideals beyond the material world. So they're not motivated by merely just lower impulses such as greed or lust or wrath or sloth or gluttony, but they actually operate on a more higher frequency. And that's why Plato said that a person has to be able to see the world of forms in order to be qualified as a philosopher king. If they can't, they can become a merchant or a soldier or a farmer or any number of other things, but they can't be trusted to really be a quality moral leader unless they can see beyond the material world.
Coming home to New Zealand, Vince, Luxon, the leader of the National Party, seems to be drawing a lot of criticism. Bearing in mind your statement from Clown World Chronicles that the ruling class appear to be unwilling or unable to change course, is this true for him at the moment, or do you think he could still change course?
I think it's too late for Luxon because he's been the leader of the opposition for a number of months now, and his polling numbers haven't really gone anywhere. He hasn't come close to overtaking Chris Hipkins as the favoured prime minister. So I don't believe that he really has. I don't believe that he's the favourite to win the election this year. He might still win, but I think that it's likely that Chris Hipkins is going to beat him. But then again, I don't know if there would be enough time left before the election. It's less than 5 months away now. I don't know if there would be enough time for National to arrange a leadership coup and then to get rid of Luxon, as well as then to uh, run the election. So I think they're probably running out of time, and they're probably just going to let Luxon go to the election.
The One News and Kantar poll on Thursday night showed National 3 points up to 37% compared with Labour on only 34%. It projects National and ACT forming a government with 62 seats. This is an interesting development, isn't it? The Maori Party ascendancy was very short lived, and the establishment right is back on top.
That particular poll was interesting, but it has to be borne in mind that if you look at the 5 or 6 most recent polls, some have had Labour and National, some have had Labour and the Greens with enough seats to form a government, and some have had National and ACT with enough seats to form a government. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see closer to the election to see if either of them have enough seats to form a government without the Maori Party. But I think what's going to complicate things the most is the New Zealand First Party, who are now polling at about 5%. If they can win 7 or more seats, then the negotiations to become the government after the election are going to be a lot more complicated.
Well, the University of Otago has released results of a study showing that drinking culture in New Zealand in high school students has significantly decreased in the last 20 years, which they are putting down to online socializing and the increased presence of parents in the home. This is a welcome trend and perhaps even a ray of hope, don't you think?
Certainly a welcome trend, and it's certainly a ray of hope, but I don't think those are the actual reasons why people are drinking less. I think there's two major reasons why people are drinking less. First is that people are starting to become aware of the deleterious effects of alcohol, particularly on the brain, that it's actually a neurotoxin, and drinking it regularly for a long period of time is actually very dangerous. The second part is I think a lot more people are using alternatives to alcohol, in particular cannabis, but also to a lesser extent MDMA and some other substances. So I think alcohol is really falling out of fashion to a large extent. It's been perceived as a boomer drug now, especially by a lot of people under 20, and I think it's just alcohol is probably going to fall away more and more, and certain other drugs are going to become a lot more popular.
Interesting. Something that I found really strange was that the researcher called for targeted measures to reduce alcohol harm further, including stricter marketing and higher taxes. This seems to me a bizarre reaction to good news. It's almost like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted, isn't it?
It's a typical authoritarian reaction to just try and ban and regulate and over mandate everything. But as far as the alternative centre is concerned, we like to take a libertarian perspective unless there's a really compelling reason to do otherwise. And so, what we would prefer to do is to legalize alternatives to booze, such as cannabis and MDMA in particular. And in that case, people would willingly use less alcohol because they could take less destructive and less harmful alternatives. So I think that would be a much more clever solution than just further bans and controls and restrictions.
Well, Vince, we have heard a lot about sustainable living, but now there's sustainable dying too. An inventor in the Netherlands is selling coffins made of hemp infused with mycelium for €995. Seems like another excellent use for mushrooms.
They love mushrooms in Northern Europe. It's the right sort of climate for them there. It's a lot colder than New Zealand and a lot damper in a lot of places. It's the right sort of environment for mushrooms to grow. So they're often thinking about the right uses for them. So I'm not surprised by this. I think this is a really good measure because then it would mean that the entire body and coffin would be biodegradable. You'd be able to just bury it somewhere and forget about it. So I think this is a good measure.
Well, apparently they can grow about 500 of these coffins a month. It's quite interesting and significant that this comes out of an area that is very conscious of the environment, isn't it?
Very conscious of the environment, and they're also very conscious of the fact that they're highly overcrowded. Like if you think the Netherlands is about, Netherlands is actually smaller by land area than just Otago by itself. But the Netherlands has 20 million people, and Otago has about 200,000. So they know that they can't have big tombs and mausoleums for every single person who dies because there's just not enough space. So they're starting to think about ways like this that you could just die and go in a mushroom coffin and decompose and be forgotten.
Well, I really like the idea. I think I'm going to open a mushroom coffin fund. I think part of my effort to make friends with death is that I'm going to commit to a mycelium mausoleum. Well, Vince, that was the week that was.
Yeah, crazy week, another crazy week. But I think things are getting more crazy as the Ukraine war heats up. So stay tuned next week. I think we'll have some more news.
The alt centre are clown world's good guys. They don't fit into boxes neatly enough to be someone else's tools.